On behalf of MRA, I'm excited that you all have chosen to spend some time with us today. We're very excited for today's fourth and final Wednesday webinar. And I want to take a moment to just thank Jennifer Kincaid, who has done an amazing job of putting this together. Each of these 4 sessions have been very well attended and have gone on without a hitch. And in spite of the fact that we weren't able to get together in person this year for our conference, she's done an amazing job of bringing some really good information out to our members and beyond all across the state. So thank you, Jennifer. Wave high. Thanks, Jennifer. Really appreciate all your hard work. Just a couple real quick announcements, and then we'll get right to it. First is hopefully you can see that this session is captioned. That you should be able to see the captions in the captioning pod within Zoom. You'll also see in the chat box, there's a link that if you click, it will open an external window where the captioning will also appear. So you've got a couple options there for the captioning piece. CEUs, if you like CEUs, before we end today at 3 o'clock, Jennifer or I will explain the process for requesting CEUs. We will make those available for those who attended today. I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters today. As you can see on your screen, the topic is disability inclusion and accommodation on college campuses. We're thrilled to have the MOAHEAD Executive Board here today. Personally, I've had a chance to get to know these folks over the last year or so, and it's been a wonderful experience. They've been great friends to MRA and great friends to VR. And I can say, going back to when I started as a VR counselor in Sedalia, I still remember using the resources that they put out back then to help a lot of the students and families that I worked with. So I know that we are in for a treat. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to, I believe Justin is starting us off.
Yes, thank you, Chris, and thank you all so much for joining us. And really, we do appreciate the invite. We have absolutely appreciated the relationship we've had and would love to continue that. And so we're really thankful to be here with you all today. So basically, in terms of the plan today, we have our presenters. Of course, now the slide's not going to work. Let's try this. There we are. Alrighty, so I'm going to have the presenters introduce themselves as we go through the presentation. As we were putting this together, I kind of realized we have lots of good info, and so hopefully we will have time to answer some of your questions at the end. If we run out of time, don't worry about that. Still go ahead and put them in the chat box or shoot those questions to Jennifer or Chris. We're happy to answer those offline. We can shoot those back to you in an email. So don't fret if we don't get to your answers today. But we do represent MOAHEAD. So AHEAD is our national organization that basically guides disability service professionals on best practice and things of that sort on disability inclusion, support, and accommodations. And so us being Missouri AHEAD, we're the state affiliate of AHEAD. So our executive board, the way it kind of worked out, we all represent kind of a different collegiate post-secondary experience. So we have our K through 12 liaison, but then also someone who represents community colleges, but then also four-year public universities, and then professional law schools. So you're going to get a little bit of perspective from all sorts of different people today. And so what we're kind of thinking as our plan is that as we're going through our presentation, we're going to end, we all have our own portion of the presentation. So when we end our section, that's when we'll ask for questions to hopefully kind of keep it going smoothly. And of course, MOAHEAD exec board members, if you think I've missed anything, feel free to interject, please, and provides that information. So, alrighty. So I am Justin Lozano. I am the MOAHEAD president, and I'm also the director of the Disability Resource Center at Missouri State University in Springfield, Missouri. So the agenda of today, what we're going to do is just talk about what we do. And of course, this is going to be kind of, I'm going to generalize it a little bit, but as you'll probably just hear even within our other presenters, that we'll have some different kind of things that we go about disability and go about accommodations. And that's going to be kind of the way it works for all institutions in Missouri. So I'm going to give you kind of like a general overview, but there might be some variances depending on where you go. I'm going to talk about medical documentation because that's a pretty common question and the guidance that AHEAD has given us on medical documentation. And then a little bit about philosophy. And then we're going to talk about perspective based on that institution type. And then, of course, hopefully have time to answer any questions that you might have. Alrighty, so Disability Services Office. So they can be all sorts of names for our offices. It's the Disability Resource Center, it's the Student Disability Center, it's the Office of Disability Support Services. You'll see the whole gamut. But generally, what we do, we meet with students with disabilities to determine those reasonable accommodations. And one thing we'd like to point out that lots of times we're thinking about academics, but it's not just academics. It's also students' housing. It can also be their activities. And when we say housing, we mean on-campus housing. So we advise students on implementing those accommodations, on how to discuss with instructors and staff. And then we also collaborate and provide support to staff, faculty, instructors as well, because sometimes we come up with an accommodation and they are not sure how to implement it, or they're not sure it's going to be effective for their class. So we definitely have that process that goes back and forth to make sure they know how to implement those accommodations. And then, of course, what we're doing is kind of a reactive model, but what we're hoping to do is that I always say we hope to work ourselves out of a job. That if our university or our college is so good at being inclusive from the get go, we don't have to do so much accommodation because we've already thought about it. We've already prepared for this. So while we're also doing the accommodation side, we're trying to educate campus stakeholders, faculty, and staff members on things they can do to be more proactively inclusive and think about inclusion for people with disabilities rather than think of it as an afterthought. So the process in terms of requesting accommodations. A student usually completes a request for accommodations form. Most of the time it's online. Um, they usually provide supporting documentation, and I put in parentheses usually. I'll go over that in a second on why we say sometimes documentation is not always needed, which sometimes can shock some people sometimes. Um, the student will schedule an access planning meeting with an access advisor. So you might hear access specialist, an access advisor, someone to that effect. But basically, that's where the meeting happens between the student and that advisor to determine those reasonable accommodations. They have that meeting, we call it the interactive process, and then any accommodations that might be determined, we will create, and then an accommodation memo, and then any referrals that we might make. So it could be, hey, we got these accommodations, but we really think it'd be good for you to visit our tutoring center or our writing center or maybe the counseling center. And so those kind of resources we will advise students during those meetings to make sure they know that they're available to them. So that accommodation memo is created. So the accommodation memo, one thing to know in college, which our my fellow exec board members will talk about too, is that the accommodation memo will state the student's accommodations, but it says nothing about their disability typically. Okay, so that's something different between college and K through 12. The student will take that accommodation memo, provide that to their instructor, and discuss those accommodations. So something that's a little different between some schools. So at Missouri State University, we have the student download and either print or email their memo to the instructor. But some schools will just say, hey, do you want us to email the memo on your behalf? And so you're kind of seeing both right now. So if you're working with students, you might prepare them that sometimes, depending on the school, they may have to provide it, or the Disability Resource Center might provide it. But the really important thing to note is that the student should have a conversation with the instructor about how to make those accommodations happen. All right. And then, so documentation, this is one that we get a lot of questions about. So what kind of documentation do I need and that sort of thing? So I'll give you what we consider best practice and what our national organization has provided to us. So in 2012, AHEAD put out some guidance on documentation, and here is their guidance. And here's why I put in parentheses usually. If a student, what they're saying is that, who better the expert of living with the disability than the student living with the disability? So what they say is that, our primary documentation shouldn't necessarily be medical documentation, but actually the student's self-report. And so when the student comes to our office, what we do is we meet with that student and we say, we have some questions. We kind of go through that interactive process. And what a head kind of says is that, if they're a good historian about their disability, what they're requesting and what they're purporting matches, how many more hoops do we need to put the students through to approve accommodations? Okay. Um, and so what we're also, so our notes from that interaction can actually be our documentation for accommodations. Ahead also for the secondary documentation, ahead says it's the observation and the interaction. And so we can use our observances during that appointment to also document and support accommodations. So, just like the other day, one of my advisors, the student talked about panic attacks, and they had a panic attack in the middle of that appointment. And so obviously we can note that and say, we just watched it, we just saw it happen. And one example that, I always like to give is that, maybe we have a student who comes in, they have their service animal and they have their white cane. Am I going to ask that student, I need you to provide me medical documentation that says you're blind? I think we could probably figure that one out based on that observation, right? And so we're allowed to document that. But then we can still ask for that medical documentation. So maybe someone says, I have ADHD, but I need to request flexibility regarding attendance in class. Well, based on our interaction, I'm not sure how the ADHD meets this flexibility regarding attendance. So let's ask about, do you have some medical documentation that might talk about, might support why you're requesting that? And so that's not to say that we don't want medical documentation. I very much want medical documentation. We just don't want documentation to be a gatekeeper from the student coming to come see us and to talk with us. And so I always say, if you have medical documentation, that'd be helpful to know, because even at our best with doing the interview, we might see something in that documentation that goes, oh, that's good to know. Or also what we're trying to do is think a couple steps ahead. So like even at Missouri State, we're talking about like, so are you thinking about grad school? And students are kind of like, oh, well, I just got here, why are you talking to me about grad school? Well, you'll kind of find out later on in our presentation that when it comes to entrance exams into grad school, medical documentation is different. Or going into grad school, those accommodations can be different too. So it just kind of helps us plan and prepare for what might be coming in the future. All righty. Okay, and so I wanted to make sure I didn't want to rush through it, but I want to get through it quickly because everyone else has such good info to share. Are there any questions in the chat or any questions right now that I can answer pertaining to the interactive process or medical documentation?
Don't see any questions yet, Justin.
All righty. Okay, well, Kathy, I think you're up, and I'll advance the slides for you.
All right, thank you. My name is Kathy Kleins. I am actually a school psychologist in the Fort Zumwalt School District, and I am serving on the Moahead Board as the K through 12 liaison. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about special education in the K through 12 realm. And I know many of you with VR are probably involved in that. I worked for 20 years in a high school setting, so had lots of meetings with different VR reps who would come in, especially that senior year, to those IEPs. So, all right, next slide. Looking at K through 12. K through 12 is governed by the Public Law 94-142 or through IDEA. IDEA basically says that every student should receive a free and appropriate public education. Because of that, then in that K through 12 setting, our emphasis is always on success versus access. So every student is expected to go through K through 12 and to graduate. Not every student who goes to college is expected to go from day one to graduation. So that is a little bit of a difference that we need to look at what does that student require in order to receive a free and appropriate public education in a K through 12 setting. We do normally work with students all the way from ages 3 all the way to 21, or once they graduate from high school. Once they graduate from high school, IDEA no longer covers them. Or some students we have, they're here until the age of 21. So, but after that age of 21, then they age out of our system. Our school districts are responsible for what we call child find. We are responsible that if there's any student that we suspect might have a disability, we need to do an evaluation at our expense and see whether or not that child has a disability or not. And another difference, parents are the educational decision makers until the child turns 18. So at our meetings and everything, the parent is the one making the decision. The parent is the one we're contacting. We're setting up meetings with parents. Once a child turns 16, we are inviting them to their meetings. But once they turn 18, then that child is the one that we set the meetings up with. However, in a high school setting, most of the time those 18-year-olds are still living at home with mom and dad. So mom and dad are still invited to come to those meetings. The student normally has to sign a release for us to invite mom and dad, unless they are emancipated or living on their own. And then in that case, it might be just the student who's coming to that meeting. But generally speaking, parents have a big role in that K through 12 arena. All right. Next, I just listed here the different disabilities that we serve. Our disabilities are based upon what Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education defines as a disability. This also comes from, federal kind of standards. So our disabilities can sometimes look very different than disabilities you see elsewhere. For example, as Justin referred to, lots of kids have ADHD. As you see, ADHD is not specifically a disability that we have a label for in the K through 12 setting. A lot of times a kid with ADHD might be serviced under what we call other health impairment, which means they have a medical condition that's affecting their strength, vitality, or their alertness in a classroom setting. Also, specific learning disability, there's a specific criteria from state to state how we define that. It can differ from Missouri to Illinois to Kansas. So, those of you, working in that college setting, you see a kid you see a wide variety of kids coming in with learning disabilities based upon different criteria. Autism also can be very different than a medical diagnosis of autism. Our educational eligibility is a little bit different than just automatically having that medical diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So those are the different disabilities: autism, deaf and blind, emotional disturbance, deafness, hard of hearing, intellectual disabilities, language impairment, multiple disabilities, an orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, sound system disorder, specific learning disability, traumatic brain injury, vision, and then a young child with a developmental delay. So next, looking at, as I kind of referenced, IEPs, or an individual education plan, defines how we work with students in the K through 12 arena. Our IEPs outline goals, the services, and the accommodations that student is going to receive in the schools. Services may include a variety of things. Generally speaking, it's going to indicate what kind of instruction that student is going to receive. It could be instruction from a special ed teacher. It could be specific therapies such as speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. We even have music therapy. And then we also have, for some students, individual or group kind of behavioral therapies. So all of those services are listed in that child's IEP, and how many minutes per week or how many minutes per month that student is going to receive that service. So next, looking at, I jotted down here the other thing I mentioned that IEPs include, or those accommodations. Oftentimes we tell the students, this is what's important when you go on to the college setting. These are the things that we have done for you that are different than what we would do for a general ed student. And these are the types of things that they need to ask for when they get to that college setting. I jotted down a few common ones that we've seen. You may see a shortened or modified assignment. You may see that tasks are broken down into steps for that student, alternative testing environments or test read, exam questions clarified or paraphrased. The student may have preferential seating. Teachers may be encouraged to check in for understanding. Class notes might be provided, or extended time to complete classwork, homework, or exams. So these are kind of just general. Accommodations can include anything though. I mean, it's whatever that IEP team, the parent, the teacher, and the student all determine that student requires in order to make that academic progress. As I stated, that IEP team, it has to consist of a general education teacher, a special ed teacher, the parent, and then the student once they turn 16. Now, once the student turns 16, we have to get their input We do have some students at the high school who still don't want to come to those kinds of meetings. And so they'll give their input ahead of time. However, we really do encourage, and actually at our high school, we really started bringing students in once they hit high school. So once they were a freshman and they were 14, it's like, we're talking about you. You need to have a vested interest in this, and you need to understand kind of what's going on. And it's looking at that transition of, when they go on to college, they're going to have to be the one advocating for themselves. So the more we can educate them in the high school setting of what is their disability, what is it that you need to be successful, then hopefully that can transfer over to that college setting. And then finally, looking at, like I said, probably one of the most important parts of an IEP, especially in high school, is what we call Form C, or our transition plans. This is when we invite, outside agencies to come to those IEP meetings. We're all sitting down looking at what is the student's goals. And that Form C is going to contain a couple of different areas. The first one is, what is the student's goal when it comes to education or training? And the way we have to write that is, Kathy, will attend a four-year university. And so then we come up with what are some of the things that student needs to do this year in order to get them ready for college. It might be that they're going to investigate what colleges they want to go to, investigate, just the entrance requirements to that college. Maybe the student has taken the ACT and hasn't scored really well in the ACT, so is looking at, University of Missouri in Columbia really realistic at this point in time. So the next area is employment. The student once again has to come up with that employment goal. What is it that at this point in time they're thinking they might want to do? Once again, we come up with strategies. They might be, for example, say we have a student who says, I want to become a pediatrician. Okay, great. We're going to then investigate what it requires to become a pediatrician. And, we find out that you have to take classes like biology and chemistry, and you have to go to graduate school, medical school. And then the student realizes, wow, that's a lot. Maybe that's not really what I want to do, but I really do want to do something in the medical field. So it really does kind of help that student be a little more realistic with what their post-secondary goals are. And then the last area on that Form C is independent living. And for some students, this is not going to be an area of concern. They're going to live like in a dorm, live with parents, whatever. But some of our more severe students, they may be living in a group home, or they may be living with family until they can get enough skills to be able to live in some kind of supported living type of environment. So once again, those are those three areas that we really, really try to hone in on and come up with some action plans for what is it that we can do to help the student. Form C also includes a four-year plan, which is a four-year plan states what classes that student should be taking in the next 4 years. That is not set in stone. We tell parents that can vary. It's just that if a child says that they want to become a pediatrician and we have them in Woods 1, Woods 2, Metals 1, Metals 2, have we helped them go to a four-year college and they've never taken any kind of anatomy and physiology class, yet they're going to become a doctor. So we really need to start being thoughtful about what classes it is that they're taking in high school that is going to help them. And then we also have that anticipated graduation date. So, and I think that is it for my piece. Any questions that anybody has regarding K through 12?
I don't see any yet, but
Okay.
but thank you very much, and we'll let you know if any pop up.
Okay, I think it's my turn. Hi, everybody. I'm Teresa Smythe, and I am a disability support specialist. I'm also the secretary of MOAHEAD. I work for St. Louis Community College, and I'm here to talk a little bit about community colleges as unique. Clearly, from this point on in our presentation, we will be talking about something quite unique from what Kathy Klein's talked about. The big difference here is we've moved from IDEA to ADA. And so it is the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 that really have governed what we do in community colleges and universities. And we all do them quite differently. So what I tried to do was consider what community colleges do that are maybe unique. We have more probably things that are common in the college world, but there are some unique features. So community colleges, for example, big unique feature is the open enrollment. So if a student has graduated high school, completed the high set, they are eligible to enroll. Actually, they're eligible to enroll without those items. They just aren't eligible to graduate without those items completed. So that's different because then we have a very broad, wide variety of students with broad and differing skills and abilities. It also means that community colleges will often have more in the line of developmental education, in other words, pre-college level coursework to get them ready, students ready for colleges. So that's a kind of a unique thing about community colleges. We also have students who are there under A+ funding. These would be students who have met eligibility at their schools, assuming that they are from eligible, A+ eligible programs. I'm going to assume everybody knows what A+ funding is from the state of Missouri. And if you don't, feel free to ask and I'll try to answer that. A+ funding is made available by the state to students in public, private, and homeschool settings. So that often is a bit of a constraint because they have a full-time requirement unless you have a disability. And then we are in the position of having to determine whether that student would be eligible for part-time, to be part-time students and still get their money from A+. So that's something. We can go on to the next slide, please. Community colleges have a variety of types of programs, as do all colleges, but I just wanted to tell you some of ours. So the options at most community colleges include degrees, the AA degree, the Associate of Arts, the Associate of Arts in Teaching. The AAS is the Associate of Arts and the Associate of Applied Science degrees. We have certificates of proficiency and specialization. Right now, our college, as many colleges across the land, are starting to offer bachelor's degrees in community college. We are also soon going to be offering a couple of bachelor's degrees at St. Louis Community College, and there are other colleges in our state that are starting to do the same thing. All these degrees, we provide transfer options. So many of them are AA and AAT degrees, are really designed as transfer degrees. So the students are coming and completing their first 2 years of college at the community college, and then moving on to university. Some of our degrees and certificates are career-focused programs. And so at the conclusion of their 2-year, which usually takes 3 to 4 years, at the end of that 2-year program, they are job ready. We also offer a number of stackable credentials programs, and that means, that programs that will build on one another and give varied levels of credentialing to students. So those are the college options. Community colleges also have a number of continuing education options that are not college credit, but they might be advancing professional development for some people. And some of our courses will be skills and credential training. We also have accelerated job training, which is a no cost or low cost way to become trained to do a specific job. And I'll give you an example of our accelerated job training. St. Louis Community College works with Boeing and to train people to do a couple of different things. One of them is sheet metal, I forget what they actually call it, but development of sheet metal. And so they are trained at St. Louis Community College. Students will come in and go for a 6-week training. It is free. It is full-time. It's like going to a full-time job. It's free. And at the end of it, if they have successfully completed it, a high likelihood of being hired by Boeing immediately. I don't know that anybody completes and isn't hired by them. So that it is very job specific, company specific and job specific. But we also have truck driving training and all kinds of things. So if you go to our website, you'll see all that. Well, a lot of community colleges are doing what's called workforce development and through accelerated job training. And it's an excellent option for a lot of young people coming out of high school who maybe don't want or can't for some reason attend college, need to get into the workforce ASAP. There are some programs that do cost money, but they are very reasonable cost. So something to really look at when you're working with people, young people. And we also have, and I'm sorry, the way this, I think I did something wrong on this slide, but continuing education also provides a variety of opportunities for personal enrichment. And we do have a number of students who come who might have intellectual disabilities that are too great to really get into college immediately. So they will start by taking just those personal enrichment courses, some of which will last a week or maybe several weeks, just to see how they do to be in the environment of a college and exploring some of their interests and skill sets so we can better guide them on how to, work, how to get jobs doing the things that they love and are good at. So those are the kinds of programs and things that are available at community colleges that we work with. And we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So accommodations are provided for all classes and all the programs that we talked about, as well as any college-sponsored activity or community programs. So all of our colleges and universities will have many community options like theater and art galleries and stuff. So if the college sponsors it, the college is responsible for making sure that accommodations are provided for equal access. So I just want you to be aware of that. We have students joining clubs and joining committees and clubs, and they have to be accommodated there. So if they are deaf and they need interpreters for these things, they have them. If they need somebody to take notes for them, they'll have that as well. We also have study abroad programs, and we've got to make sure that the people that attend those are properly accommodated as well. So we can move on to the next slide, please. We have a process I'm going to give you the process at St. Louis Community College. It's very similar everywhere. So this is what you can expect in terms of process and requirements for students to receive accommodation. First of all, the student has to self-disclose. So that's a big difference from when they were in grade school and high school. They have to come to us. We're not there waiting. Well, we are waiting for them. We're not there accepting their IEPs and then letting everybody know. The student has to come to us. And they do that by applying. So we have an application for service, or some people have a request for service and accommodation form. Once they have disclosed they have a disability and that they need accommodation, they meet with a disability support specialist to discuss the limitations of their disability and their accommodation needs and what they would like while they are in college. after that meeting, and that meeting is where Justin made reference to primary documentation. This meeting and that application that they send in is where we get that primary documentation. We are taking notes and we're writing up what students are telling us about themselves and about their how they function and what they need. And that's very, very important to our process. At that time too, we can, make our own observations. As Justin said earlier, the student who comes in with a, cane or a dog, a student who comes in a wheelchair, some things are obvious and we don't know how much more obvious they can be. Now we might actually require some or request some documentation so that we can better accommodate, so that we have a better understanding of those seemingly obvious disabilities, but we might not. But students are generally asked to provide documentation that will verify diagnoses that we might not be able to verify visually. We want that verified. We'd like to know what functional limitations are there, and we want to know who diagnosed it. This is most helpful with chronic illness, with what we call invisible disability. Some examples are we will accept IEPs, and I don't know about universities, but at community colleges, IEPs are being accepted from when a student was 6 years old, if that's all they can find in their stack. As long as we can determine a history and apply our own professional judgment to the situation, we will take IEPs. We'll take whatever they present to us and we'll determine whether or not we have enough information to approve accommodations. So VR reports, physicians reports, VA forms, all kinds of things that we get. Then upon approval from the access office, the student meets with us a second time to just talk about next steps and self-advocacy and make sure they're really ready to roll on, with their accommodations. Is there another slide, Justin? Okay, good, because otherwise I thought I left these out. Then the student is provided with an instructor notification memo. And that is what they provide to their instructors. And then they converse with their instructors about the specifics of receiving those accommodations. They're not required to talk to the teacher about their disability. We ask them, we tell them that that's up to them. And if they wish to do that, they can, but there is absolutely no need to do that. Then they can communicate, from then on, they communicate any additional accommodation needs they have throughout the semester directly to our office or to a program specific staff. So what I mean by that is, let's say they're going to an event on campus and the event is sponsored maybe by the geology club. They can let the people in the geology club know that they need a particular accommodation while they're at this event, and then the geology club will work with our office to get those taken care of. So that's how it goes at community college. Are there any questions from anyone?
We've had a couple pop up, and I'm not
Okay.
sure if these are directed specifically to you, Teresa, or
Okay.
I'll just ask it, and whoever feels like they want to provide an answer, jump in. But Christy asks, what kind of accommodations can someone with a panic disorder get in college?
That's a really good question, and I'll go ahead and answer it. And I think that if my colleagues have anything to add, they certainly can, because we all deal with this. So for example, what that instructor notification memo might tell the instructor is that this student may need to leave the classroom for a brief period of time, assuming that, the person is having flare-up of that symptom of panic. And so that allows them to get out of the room and, get themselves under some control, I guess. Another thing might be that they do need extra time for tests or in-class assignments so that they can deal with the anxiety that leads to those panics and maybe prevent that from happening. There might also be a need to discuss disability-related sort of absence, depending on how the degree of this panic disorder. Those are some things. Anybody else have anything to add to that?
This, Teresa,
Heather?
this is Heather. I had some other thoughts, and I would preface my thoughts by saying, excuse me, that of course we would try to information directly from that student who may be bringing this disability to us, because panic disorder can manifest differently in students. But I would also likely look at within testing if the student if it may be important for the student to be able to take breaks during testing, or if they may need to be able to take exams in, say, a distraction reduced room or a private room. Obviously relevant right now because we're all, for the most part anyway, a lot of exams are online, but we would still be looking at this. So it can vary really depending upon what the student may bring up, but I'll let the other colleagues share some additional.
And this is Becca Terry. I'm Vice President with Mizzou. The only thing that I would add on to that is really the beauty of the interactive process, is because we can really talk about what is potentially triggering some of those panic attacks. Is it that I may be randomly called on in class that is triggering those? So kind of figuring out what it is for the student that is the trigger, and then potentially addressing that through the accommodation. So variety of things.
Thank you. And I'm glad she brought that up, because it is really important to know triggers. That helps us determine. This is why we have to talk to students, because, even wonderful physicians, can tell you that the person has panic attacks, but they don't always know all of the things that really cause that. And you have to get that from the student. We could spend probably most of the rest of the time talking about that particular one. Are there any other questions that I could answer quickly?
Teresa, this is Chris. Actually, Christy kind of opened the floodgates there. We got several questions that came in right after that. So
Okay.
if it's okay with everyone, I want to make sure we have time to get through the content,
Yes.
and then we'll come back
Yes.
to questions.
Yes, that would be great. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next phase. Justin.
All right, so that's my turn, my cue. I'm Becca Terry. Like I said, I am the Vice President for Moahead, and I'm also an Access Advisor at the University of Missouri. And so, kind of being mindful of time, I'm going to kind of be selective of some of the information that I talk about, because we could go on and on all day long talking about this stuff. So Justin, if you could go to the next slide. So one of the things that I think really differentiates the four-year public institution from, say, a community college is that irregardless of disability status, all students must meet the same admission criteria to be admitted. And so, some of that is going to be looking at ACT scores, SAT scores, GPA from high school, those sorts of things. Students are also expected to meet all of the same expectations, learning outcomes as other students within the course. So that it can be kind of challenging for students who may have a learning disability in meeting the foreign language requirements, because maybe their foreign language had been waived throughout high school. So if that is part of a requirement of their academic unit. We got to talk about, okay, what are some ways that we could get you to meet those requirements? And sometimes that is a course substitution for foreign language. So they would just have to meet some alternative, but that is also where that interactive process is really helpful as well, because we can talk through, okay, what is the barrier that you're experiencing when it comes to foreign language? Well, I just have never had to take it because I have a learning disability. Okay, well, what are some other options? An option at University of Missouri is American Sign Language as an alternative to a spoken language, which can sometimes be more helpful for students. They also have to meet the same math requirements. Again, if there is a documented disability and evidence that they are just unable to do math, not just that they haven't learned math, but that they cannot do math because of their learning disability, then we will consider those alternatives as well. And that is really where we would look at documentation from a third party. So psychoeducational evaluation, something like that, to really show us where that student's abilities fall in that area. All right, Justin. And so really at the university and other institutions, the responsibility of providing accommodations is really a partnership. So it's a responsibility of the student, the instructor, and the disability services office to ensure that accommodations are implemented. So the student must contact the disability services office to establish an accommodation plan. They must also notify instructors of their accommodations as soon as possible. And then the instructors have the responsibility of ensuring that those approved accommodations are implemented. And the disability services staff are going to be here to help facilitate those accommodations and to ensure that appropriate accommodations are established. And if maybe an accommodation is not appropriate for a certain class, finding alternatives to those accommodations. And just providing ongoing support to both the student and the institution. All right, Justin. All right, so part of that interactive process that we're going to go through, we are going to talk through all of their history with their disability, any ongoing care that they're receiving for their disability, identifying barriers and challenges as it pertains to all of the campus. So in that process, like Justin had mentioned earlier, we are also going to get them connected to other campus resources as appropriate. So like Justin mentioned, the tutoring center, writing center, counseling center, if they want to get connected to any multicultural centers on campus, then we will get them connected to getting them connected to their financial aid advisors. And at a four-year public institution like Mizzou, there are many different people that a student can get connected with. And sometimes our office is not the best fit for a variety of needs. So I am by no means an expert on financial aid aside from my own debt in financial aid. So I'm going to get them connected to their financial aid advisor if they bring up any financial constraints, or maybe it's an individual is kind of talking about different challenging circumstances kind of outside of their educational experience, then we can get them connected to appropriate resources for that. All right, Justin. And we really do encourage that this process starts as soon as possible. because one of those reasons is at a four-year public institution that has residential living, we want to make sure that those housing accommodations are set up before they even make it to campus. So like right now, we're starting to have housing meetings, housing accommodation meetings for students who are coming next fall. And that is just to ensure that our residential life folks are able to find the best room fit for those students. And so academic accommodations will then be kind of discussed later, closer to their attendance on campus. So over the summer, just before semester starts, even that first week of semester, throughout the first semester, throughout their academic journey, we can do this process at any point in their academic journey. In fact, I just met with a student earlier this week who's due to graduate in December, and we're setting up accommodations. So it's really flexible. The challenge is when students wait until they're kind of already in the hole as far as their grades go, and then trying to recover those grades with accommodations and resources can just be a little bit more challenging. So really want them to come in and self-identify as soon as possible. And then if they need to modify accommodations throughout their academic journey, we can certainly do that. Students just need to let us know. I know I personally have over 400 students on my caseload. And so tracking down where a student is at as far as their academics go, it can be super challenging, and I don't always catch those. So that's also one of those things where independence is really important, as well as self-advocacy. All right, Justin. And again, they just have to self-identify, provide us with documentation as needed. One of the things that I try to tell students, and it seems really weird in their freshman year, but is to let them know if they are thinking about graduate or professional school, so after undergrad, they are likely going to have to provide documentation that has to be within a certain time frame. And I'm sure Heather will talk about that a little bit more, but making sure that they are getting updated evaluations as soon as possible is going to be really important to ensure that they have accommodations as they take their entrance exams for grad school. And then comprehensive support. So we try to get students connected with their appropriate resources. I will also say that I can't and don't ensure that students are always getting connected to those resources, again, because of the amount of students that are on my caseload. So it really is going to be key for them to drive those connections a little bit further. I can make those connections while the student's in my office, or right now via Zoom, but I can't ongoingly ensure that they are completing the tasks that we discuss. And as Kathy mentioned before, in K-12, kind of students are participatory later on in their academic career in high school as far as setting up accommodations, but they are the driver of their accommodations through post-secondary education. And so mom and dad, as much as we want to support the parents as well, we can't talk about anything pertaining directly to the student without a release of information from the student. So that is something else that is kind of different at this point. All right, and so one thing that I'll touch on really quickly is the deadlines and attendance component. These adjustments to the deadlines is very rare, as is modification to attendance policies. I had one student who indicated that they hadn't attended a single day in their entire senior year. And that becomes very challenging in a 4-year public institution because, again, they are the drivers of their education, and so much of what is going on in the classroom really involves participation. And so we evaluate these on a case-by-case basis, really looking at if it's a mental health related condition, is this falling in line with the treatment provider's plan for that individual, and if it seems reasonable. Lack of motivation is rarely a situation where we would establish flexibility with attendance or deadlines at the University of Missouri. But again, each student is entirely different, and we look at those through the interactive process involving that documentation. And then one thing that we might establish for students is a reduced course load. So if they're having a hard time managing all of their coursework, we may establish that they can be considered a full-time student, but with taking that fewer than 12 credit hours. But again, based on each individual student, it's not something that we just automatically establish. All right, and just challenges, like I mentioned before, we are not able to provide comprehensive programs currently at the University of Missouri. I know that's something that a lot of parents request from us, but we aren't able to do that currently. So families are indicating that they're wanting us to check in with their student weekly, making sure that they're meeting their activities for daily living and making sure that they have accountability and that sort of thing. And we just aren't able to provide that. And the one other thing that I hear from students is that I tried to do it without my accommodations, and I didn't want that my disability to be a crutch. And that's why I waited until 10 weeks into the semester. So as I mentioned, getting connected earlier is better. And this is all driven by the student. And I hope that all made sense. I was trying to squeeze it into enough time to give Heather sufficient time to talk about our professional and graduate programs.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Heather Stout, and I'm the Accessibility and Wellness Coordinator at St. Louis University. I am going to specifically talk about, because MOAHEAD wanted to include information about students that you may be working with that are looking at going on to graduate or, in my case, professional program as their career path. So I'm specifically working with law students who are requesting accommodations in the law school setting. And Becca, your comment about documentation is really an important one. A lot of the students that I work with have sat for the LSAT, the law school admissions test. And so they may have updated documentation, which is helpful. There's also another group of students that chose not to request accommodations for the LSAT, maybe were denied for accommodations on the LSAT, and so assume that they can't have accommodations in law school. So I end up working and consulting with a whole range of students, in addition to students who've never used accommodations before. Once they get to the graduate/professional level, and the amount of reading, the amount of writing that they're required to do is fairly intense. You know, the law school textbooks are very dense that our students are working on. So just going to talk a little bit about my process at SLU Law, and it is very similar to what you've already heard from Teresa and from Becca. So we have a process where students would initiate a request with me, and I meet with each student one-on-one to engage in an interactive process. The student would share documentation, and Justin already shared, there's, primary documentation for me is going to really be what the student presents themselves. And then I'm going to be interpreting, making a professional judgment about what the student provides to me, as well as documentation. But it is, again, that case by case and interactive process. I'm very aware that a lot of the students are going to have older documentation, and that may be just fine. I also know that I'm potentially going to be encountering students that were denied accommodations on a standardized test, and so they assume they will not be eligible to use anything in the law school setting. And so I try to circulate out information to encourage students to just contact me and ask questions. Our accommodations end up looking very similar to what a student may have used in the 4-year setting. However, the way that we actually implement accommodations is going to look different. And that has more to do with, again, I'm talking about law school. Law schools have an anonymous grading system. And so there is no exchange of a letter with faculty, because our faculty do not know which students have accommodations and which don't. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And I did want to just share that I think certainly in post-secondary, I think we're all experiencing a significant growth in the number of students who are actually coming to our offices to request accommodations. And we try to sort out information to students to encourage them. We're also, there are students who may have disabilities that are manifesting for the first time in college or in graduate school / professional programs. So we want to make sure that students who have no experience with accommodations also know that we're a resource. There is no requirement that they have to have used accommodations before they reach out to us. The other thing that I make sure students know is that, we keep all of our records are kept separate from the students' academic records. So their transcript is not going to reflect anything about whether they did or did not accommodations. It's simply going to reflect the courses they took and the grades they received and the degree they were awarded, majors, minors, that sort of thing. Justin, you can go on to the next slide. So in terms of the slight difference setting, which is of the law school environment, once students are actually approved to receive, or we've created a plan together for accommodations, we don't then create a letter that's given to the faculty. I simply work directly one-on-one with that student, and in some cases, for example, most of our students have testing accommodations. That's probably the #1 most common accommodation across all the students requesting at SLU Law. And so I may be working with the registrar's office. She is the one, it's a woman in our case, she is the one who actually inputs all information into our testing software about each student. All of our students have a testing number that's associated with them. That allows them to be anonymously graded. So the professor has no idea that Jane Smith and John Smith are test #1 and test #2. They simply see test 1, test 2, and no names. And so I forward to our registrar all the students with accommodations, including what that time extension may be. And that's true right now. When we are back in person, and before we went to remote testing, the students would work with me. I would provide them with the exams, and we would proctor the exams allowing them to use extended time, distraction reduced, private room, tests on colored paper, whatever the accommodations may be. But again, there's no interaction with the professor really, except for if we may need their assistance in, say, finding a peer note taker if we're having difficulty doing that. So again, the second point, we're using an anonymous grading system so that the students are ranked first to last. So there is no information that's given directly to the faculty. Justin, you can go to the next slide. I think another thing that's true about law schools, and I'm going to throw in medical schools as well, is that I think a lot of us did not recognize the significance of accommodations at our level up until more recently. If you talk to many medical schools, they might even say, well, we don't believe that there are many students with disabilities in our at our institution. We're beginning to realize that is absolutely not the case. I mean, I know it's not the case. I've actually worked in, at the college level. And so we're very aware that the percentages are there. And so our law school and medical school settings are really starting to talk more about disability inclusion, particularly mental health. That's a big one. In the legal profession, lawyers are beginning to look very closely at wellness and well-being. And in fact, my position itself was created because SLU Law wanted to not only have someone coordinate disability accommodations, but they were seeing a growing need in the area of wellness and mental health resources. And so that's a secondary part of my role, which we're realizing is a very large area. Excuse me. So in my case, when I'm working with students to implement accommodations, I'd already referenced this, but I'm really working most closely with such partners as the registrar's office, potentially the admissions office if I'm seeking to identify, just as an example, if I'm looking for students to be a note taker, the admissions office actually has a lot of knowledge about each student that's admitted to SLU Law. And so sometimes I'm asking them, do you have any students in the first year, or the 1L, we call them, the 1L class that might be good to reach out to about being a note taker? In our case, I'm in the student services office with several coordinators. And so the dean of students area, which is where I'm at, is definitely a very significant stakeholder and partner in my work. The Title IX officer is in the office next to me. The registrar is in the office on the other side of me. And then our financial aid coordinator is 2 offices down. And then our diversity coordinator for the campus is 2 doors the other direction. So we're all right in the same office together and end up collaborating quite a bit. In my case, in terms of students who are attending law school, these are not students who are residential, that we don't have residence halls. So they're typically traveling, they're living off campus or living and working full time. So some of them have families, they're older, they tend to be more mature. Some of them are working full time. So there's quite a bit of difference between the students I'm working with versus, say, your typical 18-year-old college student. So yeah, and as a result, if it's a student who has not been documented as having a disability before, I keep on hand quite a bit of information about how we can look at provisional services and get the student connected to resources if they need to actually go through the process of getting documented. In our case, we have the Missouri MOLAP, which is the Missouri Lawyers Assistance Program, is a free resource to our law students and can actually connect them with evaluation, limited evaluation and assessment. So see, Justin, I think we can go on to the next slide. Okay. I wanted to talk about the relevance to all of you in terms of voc rehab. I'm definitely working with a smaller percentage of students who are working with VR. And that was actually true at my last institution, which was a private 4-year as well. However, the student veterans and the military students, that was where I potentially was interacting with students who were also connected to voc rehab, particularly the veterans, the disabled veterans. I'm not typically working with voc rehab or coordinating with any of the counselors, but we always inquire so that if the student is needing to keep VR informed, that we can try to provide information. I already mentioned this, but our law students are typically not living in, well, they're never living in on-campus housing at SLU Law because we don't have on-campus housing. And so as far as your work, again, as voc rehab counselors, that housing cost piece is going to be different because it's not attached to the university. So it's not like there's tuition and housing costs within the same institution. The student may actually be looking at housing costs that are completely separate. They may be renting an apartment or otherwise. But another piece of information for you as the voc rehab counselors, the textbook costs are very significant for our law students because the textbooks are gigantic and they're just very large books. And so that's something I'm aware of. And if I could just kind of take a tangent for a moment, one of the accommodations that I work with that is, I think, very important, and I know my colleagues do this too, but they do. But one of the accommodations that we work with and can work with at the law school, so I want people to know that this is available, we can obtain law books in alternate format for students who may have visual issues or a learning disability, dyslexia, for example, or for other reasons. I've worked with students with physical disabilities that could not actually hold the textbooks. And so we can obtain their law books in digital format and get them connected with screen reading software. So Justin, I may have maybe one more slide. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So the other thing that I was just thinking about in terms of your information as a voc rehab counselor working with potentially a law student is that keeping in mind that I'm working right now with several students who have personal care attendants and are also managing the transportation costs because they don't drive. So they're using accessible transportation to get to and from the law school. So that may be a cost that they're trying to manage. And as well, they may also be then needing to coordinate and work out the logistics transportation to their internship sites. The law students all have to do a certain number of internships hours to complete their degree. And so getting to and from, and we work closely to try to identify accessible internships, but just again, the logistics of transportation, they may be managing on their own. And just sort of an unrelated but important point, disability law is definitely a growing area. And we have a range of some faculty who focus specifically on disability law and civil rights and partner with our medical school in this area. And I really think as you're working with students, encouraging them that this is a moment in time when we're actually wanting to have disabled individuals share their experience and go into fields so that we are actually addressing disability inclusion and are feeding into fields so that those fields actually have those voices involved, whether it's law, medicine, nursing, etc. I think it's so important right now to encourage disabled individuals to pursue these fields because it's only going to benefit us as a society. Justin, I'm not sure if I had any other, I think that was my last slide. Yeah.
All right. Well, this is Chris, and I just want to say I really appreciate all of you sharing your time with us today. I was keeping an eye. We had, I think, at one point over 150 folks logged in, and we still have a little over 100 that hung with us. So I think that says a lot about the quality and the importance of the content that you all brought to us today. So we really appreciate it. I know that I think Teresa, it looked like, was doing a great job of trying to answer some of the questions in the chat, and I know we're out of time. We only have a few minutes left with our closed caption service here, so we're going to try to tie a bow on things. If you didn't get your question answered from the chat, I'd encourage you to send it to the MRA email address, which Jennifer has posted in the chat, but it's mrastatechapter@gmail.com. And we can make sure we get those questions answered if that's convenient for folks. And then same there with CEUs and the PowerPoint. Jennifer's gonna, or I'm sorry, if you'd like those, send an email to that email address, and it's posted there in the chat. But again, it's mrastatechapter@gmail.com. Once again, thank you so much to the MOAHEAD Executive Board, Justin, Kathy, Teresa, Becca, Heather. We really, really appreciate it. This was a wonderful session, and we just thank you so much for your time. And maybe next year we can be together in person down at the lake like we had initially planned. So fingers crossed.
Yes, it was our pleasure. Thank you so much for having us. We really do appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a great day and stay safe.